The Mercedes Formula One team seem to finally be putting together the pieces of the puzzle with their W15 car after taking pole position with George Russell at the Canadian Grand Prix. This came after an extremely promising final practice for the team in the hands of Lewis Hamilton that looked extremely dominant against the entire grid. Now, this comes on the back of a huge upgrade push that the team have been under since the Miami Grand Prix, where they're bringing upgrades race weekend after race weekend up until a certain race, which we'll be getting into a little bit later in this video. And of course, the upgrades at Mercedes brought specifically for this weekend have culminated in Mercedes looking quite comfortably the fastest car in the drive. And this has been further proven by the telemetry data that's on the screen right now of both George Russell and Max Verstappen's quickest times in Q3. As you can see, we have the percentages of full throttle, heavy braking and cornering around their respective laps. And it's pretty much neck on neck with just 1% difference between the two of them in favour of Max being on full throttle for 1% more and George having spent 1% more in the corners. Now, when we actually look at the telemetry at the bottom with Max Verstappen being the darker of the two blues, it's quite an interesting read to say the least. So, depending on what the corner is, one of the drivers is braking that ever so slightly earlier or later than the other. But as they're going through the corner and coming out of it, they practically are neck and neck with one another. So this just kind of showcases the, I would say, more of the driver feel along with their car combination, where each have their own strengths on a certain corner that the other one doesn't. And that's where you're seeing the small discrepancies between each corner. And of course, there's a second thing to note here, and that's that George Russell picks up a 1/10.5, which looks like to be along one of the straights. So that's really interesting to see between turns 7 and 8. And then again from turns 11 down to 13, which is the final corner sequence before the end of the lap. Now, a lot of this has to do with the updates that they brought for this weekend, and that comes with the new front suspension introduced at Canada. For Canada, the track rod and lower wishbone forward leg have been realigned, and these changes have been made in order to make sure that the airflow is being directed in the manner that they wish it to, particularly so after the new front wing, which was introduced in Monaco, has completely altered where the air was being directed to. Because if you remember, the Monaco spec ring has now a full fourth upper element on there, and they've got rid of the Bahrain spec front ring, which had a lot of the third element removed. And of course, they were introducing somewhat of a Y250 vortex. Now, if we actually look at the front suspension on screen right now, you will see on the left the old front suspension and on the right the new front suspension, and there's quite a difference for the eye to see. And in the upgrade briefing published by the FIA, Mercedes said that realigning both the track rod and the lower wishbone forward leg to the local onset flow from the front ring reduces boundary layer losses and hence improves the flow to the floor. And that's what it's all about, as I just mentioned. And this is a continuation of the balance improvements that the team have been trying to bring to the W15, and that was purely on that particular aspect. There was nothing to do with increasing the downforce or anything like that. It's purely to make sure there was a consistent balance throughout all of the corner speeds that we get around the calendar, but also each phase of the corner. And it basically just tidied the airflow. And then the second step of that was to introduce the new suspension, which they have in Canada yesterday. And let's briefly go over the new front wing and all the changes that they made. As you can see from the image on the screen right now, there's lots of changes that have been undertaken for this new front wing introduced in Monaco, which has been highlighted in different colours. So let's start with the fourth element of the front wing, which is in a yellow colour. This is now extended fully to the chassis of the nose, which is highlighted in blue. Other changes, of course, as you can see on the screen, include end plate changes, which now have cutouts in them, which is something that the original front wing from this year did not have. This has taken a leaf out of the Mercedes W15's front wing introduced at Silverstone. And this is, of course, to make sure that the airflow is being guided in a certain manner which the team want it to be in. And also, the second element, highlighted in purple, has undergone a slight change in its design as well. And I also don't believe this is anything to do with kind of how the W15 bounces over the curbs. I think the suspension changes they've made, as they stated in the released article through the FIA, basically just states this is all about making sure that the airflow is guided in the way in which they want it to. And if this was something that's going to fundamentally change how the car rides curbs and its behavior through, a phase of a corner, we would have seen that put in the actual document itself. But there's been no mention of it. Now, I can't say for certain that there isn't a slight benefit from the change here, but that's something we won't know unless the team come out and state that as a fact. And alongside that, they also have introduced new brake ducts at the front as well. The increased mass flow to the disc, which in turn increases heat rejection from the disc to the air. And of course, these upgrades are part of a wider initiative that the Mercedes team are currently being run under, where they're introducing upgrades race weekend upon race weekend, and we're going to see upgrades all the way up until the Silverstone Grand Prix later in the season. And it seems that every single part that they now bring into the car is bringing a little bit more performance out of the W15, enabling them with both drivers to have a better balance, go quicker as a result, and get closer to the front. And that is evident on the circuit Gilles Villeneuve. Now, of course, we can't say for certain this is something that's going to continue and the trend has been set. This is one small sample size on one race weekend. And as we saw with the Ferrari team, who were super dominant last time out in Monaco, they're out in 11th and 12th in Q2. And for them, that was a case of just not being able to get the temperature in their tyres. So there's so many variables from a race weekend to a race weekend. But what we can say is the Mercedes team are finally getting on top of the balance issues that they've had. But there is one small thing we have to note when it comes to the Canada track, and it could be an outlier for the team, unfortunately. And that's the case that there is only slow and medium speed corners around the circuit. So, for example, if we go to other circuits later in the year, we're going to get a complete different range of speed corners. So we're going to have high speed, medium speed, low speed across an entire track. And the issue that Mercedes have had this season is being able to find a balance when you have to set the car up with all three speed ranges. So if they have to set the car up for high speed, they've been extremely bad in slow speed and vice versa. And that's why I think certain elements have played into their hands this weekend at this particular track in Canada. And fans have to be very cautious to see what happens over the next race weekends. And even today, for example, when we have the race, it could be a complete turnaround. The weather could change. It could be wet. They might not win the race. And then people are going to start, screaming from the sky, the end of the world again. Mercedes are shit, blah, 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 blah. So, have to take it as it comes. And this, hopefully you see the progression race weekend on race weekend with all the upgrades that they bring. It brings them closer and closer weekend in and weekend out. Because while they've had a very good weekend, the other teams around them haven't so. And that would be Red Bull and Ferrari. And across the 2024 season so far, they've always been the top two teams. So there's a few variables at play here. And you shouldn't get too excited if you're a Mercedes fan. But let's see what happens today, because I think if it rains, it's going to be a really interesting and exciting race. That's the video, guys. Hope you've all enjoyed it. If you have, leave a like, comment down below, and I'll catch you all in another video soon.